It was Christmas Eve, 1945. In the hills of Fayetteville, West Virginia, snow had been falling for hours. Inside a two-story timber frame house, 2 miles north of town, the Sodder family was celebrating. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children. 9 of them were home that night. Their oldest son was overseas, finishing out the war. By 1 o'clock the next morning, the house would be in flames. By dawn, it would be a smoking ruin. 5 of those 9 children would be gone. George Sodder believed they were stolen. Jenny believed it for the rest of her life. They put up a billboard with the children's faces on it. 2 miles outside town, it stood on the side of the road for 37 years. This is the case of the Sodder children disappearance. 5 missing siblings, 1 Christmas Eve fire, and a mystery that has now lasted 80 years. George Sodder was not always George Sodder. He was born Giorgio Soddu in 1895 in Tula, a small town in the hills of Sardinia, Italy. He was 13 years old when he stepped off the boat at Ellis Island. His older brother had brought him across the Atlantic. The brother went home as soon as they cleared customs. George never spoke about why he left Italy. Not to his children, not to his wife. He took the secret with him to his grave. He worked his way west, first as a water boy on the Pennsylvania railroads, then as a truck driver in Smithers, West Virginia, then as the owner of his own trucking company, hauling filled dirt, and later coal. In 1922, he married Jenny Cipriani, another Italian immigrant, the daughter of a Smithers shopkeeper. They settled outside Fayetteville, in a region of Appalachia thick with Italian families. They built a 2-story house, 2 miles north of town. Between 1923 and 1942, they had 10 children. Marion, Joe, John, George Jr., Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Irene, Betty, Sylvia. By the mid-1940s, the family was, in the words of a local official, one of the most respected middle-class families around. But George was not a man who kept his opinions quiet. He had left Italy for a reason, and by the 1920s, that reason had a name: Benito Mussolini. George Sodder hated Mussolini. He said so loudly, he said so often. He said it to anyone who would listen, including to fellow Italian immigrants in Fayetteville, who did not always agree. In 1943, Mussolini was deposed. In 1945, he was executed. The war ended. But the arguments George had started in the years before the war, those didn't end. Some of the people he had argued with were still in Fayetteville, still listening. In October of 1945, 2 strangers came to the Sodder home. Each came alone. Neither was invited. And what each of them said within weeks of each other has troubled the family for the better part of a century. The first stranger was a life insurance salesman. He came to the house in October 1945. George turned him away. He wasn't interested in buying a policy. The salesman's response was not the response of a man who had simply lost a sale. He told George that his house would, quote, go up in smoke, and that his children, quote, are going to be destroyed. The reason, the salesman said, was, quote, the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini. George showed him the door. A short time later, another stranger came to the house. This one said he was looking for work. George wasn't hiring, but he allowed the man to walk around the property. The man circled to the back of the house. He pointed at 2 fuse boxes mounted on the wall. He told George that those fuse boxes would, quote, cause a fire someday. George was puzzled. He had just had the house rewired weeks earlier when an electric stove was installed. The local electric company had inspected the wiring and pronounced it safe. The stranger left without explaining. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, George's 2 older sons noticed something else. There was a car parked along the main highway through town. Inside the car, men they did not recognize were watching the younger Sodder children as they walked home from school. Nobody in the family connected these incidents. Not yet. It was December. The war was over. Joe was due to come home soon. Marion, the oldest daughter, had taken a job at the dime store in town to help with Christmas shopping. The little ones were counting the days until the morning of the 25th. The Sodders went to bed on Christmas Eve, 1945, believing the worst was behind them. Marion came home from work that evening with surprises. She had used her dime store paycheck to buy presents for her 3 younger sisters: Martha, age 12, Jenny Irene, age 8, and Betty, the baby of the family at 5 years old. The girls were ecstatic. They begged their mother to let them stay up later than usual. Jenny said yes, with one condition. Maurice, 14, and Louis, age 10, still had chores. The cows needed to be brought in for the night. The chickens needed feeding. Once those were done, the boys could stay up too. George had already gone to bed. He had spent the day working in the fields with his 2 oldest sons, John, 22, George Jr., 16. They were all asleep by 9. At 10 o'clock, Jenny Sodder kissed her older children goodnight, picked up 3-year-old Sylvia, and carried her upstairs to bed. That was the last time she saw 5 of her children alive. At 12:30 in the morning, the telephone rang. Jenny woke, came downstairs, answered it. A woman's voice, one she did not recognize, asked for a name she had never heard of. In the background, Jenny could hear laughter, the clinking of glasses, the sound of a party. Jenny told the caller she had reached a wrong number. Before she hung up, the woman on the other end laughed. Jenny would later describe it as, quote, a weird laugh. She hung up the phone and stopped, suddenly noticing something off. The lights were still on. The curtains were not drawn. 2 things her children always took care of when they stayed up later than their parents. Marion was asleep on the living room couch. Jenny assumed the others had gone up to the attic where they slept. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, went back to bed. At 1 o'clock, she was awakened again, this time by a sound on the roof. A loud bang, then a rolling noise, like something heavy had hit the shingles, then rolled off. She listened. The house was silent. She fell back asleep. 30 minutes later, she woke for the 3rd time. This time, she smelled smoke. She came down the stairs. The room George used as his home office, the small room next to the staircase, was on fire. The flames were around the telephone line and around the fuse box. The fuse box the man looking for work had pointed at. Jenny ran upstairs and woke her husband. George woke John and George Jr. The 4 of them, along with Marion and 3-year-old Sylvia, ran for the door. They yelled up to the children in the attic. There was no answer. They tried to go back. The stairway was already in flames. George ran outside barefoot and tried to climb the side of the house. He broke a window with his bare arm to do it. His arm was cut open. He went looking for the family ladder. It was always kept against the side of the house. It was not there. He ran to his trucks. He had 2 of them. He used them every day for the trucking business. He had driven them just hours earlier. Now he intended to drive one up close to the attic window, climb on top, and pull the children out. Neither truck would start. The fire was now consuming the second floor. Marion ran a quarter mile to a neighbor's house to call for help. The neighbor's phone could not connect. A passing motorist had also seen the flames. He stopped at a roadside tavern. Their phone wasn't working either. Someone finally reached the fire department from a phone in the center of town. The Sodders stood in the snow and watched their house burn. 45 minutes later, it was gone.
The Fayetteville Fire Department had a problem. It was Christmas Eve. The war had drained the town of its young men. The department was running on volunteers who called each other in to respond to fires. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, could not drive the fire truck himself. He had to wait until someone who could drive could get to the station. The first firefighter on the scene was Jenny Sodder's own brother. He arrived at the smoking ruin of his sister's home shortly after sunrise on Christmas morning. It had been 7 hours since the fire started. Morris and his men looked through what was left of the house. The ash in the basement was still warm. There wasn't much to see. The walls were gone. The second floor was gone. The roof was gone.
By 10 in the morning, Morris told George Sodder that they had found no bones. None. Nothing that could be identified as the remains of his 5 missing children. The chief said he believed the fire had simply been hot enough to consume them completely. It was a strange thing to say. The wood frame house had collapsed in 45 minutes. Many of the household appliances, refrigerators, a washing machine, parts of the iron stove, were found in the ash. They were warped, but recognizable. The tin roof was scattered around the foundation in pieces, but not a single bone. George and Jenny were too overcome to protest. They went to stay with relatives. The local coroner convened a jury within days. The cause of the fire was officially ruled faulty wiring. There was a man on that jury. He was the same life insurance salesman who, 2 months earlier, had stood in the Sodders' front yard and told George Sodder that his house was going to go up in smoke and his children were going to be destroyed. That detail does not appear in the original death certificates. The death certificates were issued on December 30th, 1945. 5 of them. Maurice, age 14. Martha, age 12. Louis, age 10. Jenny Irene, age 8. Betty, age 5. Cause of death: fire or suffocation. The funeral was held on January 2nd. George and Jenny could not bring themselves to attend. Their surviving children went without them. 4 days later, George took a bulldozer to the foundation and pushed 5 feet of dirt over what had been their home. He said he wanted to make it a memorial garden for the children. He thought he was burying their grave. The grieving began, but the questions started almost immediately. The Sodders' Christmas lights had stayed on throughout the fire. They had remained lit until the wires that powered them physically burned through. If the fire had been caused by faulty wiring, by a short circuit in those very wires, the power should have cut out immediately. It hadn't. A few weeks later, George Jr. was walking the property and found the ladder. The family ladder. The one that was always kept against the house. The one George had searched for, frantic, on the night of the fire. It was lying at the bottom of an embankment, 75 feet away from where it should have been. Someone had moved it. Someone had thrown it. A telephone repairman came to inspect the line that had been disconnected during the fire. He looked at the pole and the wire. He told the Sodders that the line had not burned through. It had been cut. Whoever had done it had climbed 14 feet up the pole, reached 2 feet away from the pole, and severed the wire with a blade. A man was eventually arrested in connection with the cutting. He had been seen stealing a block and tackle from the Sodder property in the days before the fire. He admitted to the theft. He also admitted to cutting the line, claiming he had mistaken it for a power line. He could not explain what business a thief had cutting power to a house in the middle of the night. He was eventually released. No one knows what became of him. Jenny began to do something nobody else thought to do. She started burning bones. She would take small piles of animal bones, chicken, beef, whatever she could get from her cooking, and burn them in the open flame of her stove. She burned them at higher temperatures than her house could have produced. She burned them for longer. The bones never disappeared. Not once. Always there was something left behind. She wrote to a crematorium in a nearby town. The operator wrote back. He told her that even at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained for 2 hours, human bones do not fully disintegrate. The Sodder house had burned for 45 minutes. The temperature was much lower. There should have been bones in the ash, the bones of 5 children. There were none. Then, in the spring of 1946, after the snow melted, Sylvia, the youngest, the toddler who had survived, found something in the grass near where the house had stood. It was a small object, hard, dark green, about the size of a baseball. It looked like rubber, but it wasn't rubber. George recognized it immediately. As a former railroad worker who had seen combat surplus during the war, he knew what it was. It was the casing of a pineapple grenade, an incendiary device. His wife had heard a bang on the roof at 1 o'clock in the morning, then a rolling noise. Someone had thrown it. George Sodder hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town of Gawley Bridge. Tinsley began turning over rocks. The first rock he turned over was the coroner's jury, the same jury that had ruled the fire accidental. Tinsley confirmed that the life insurance salesman who had threatened George, who had told him his house would burn and his children would be destroyed, had not only been allowed on that jury, he had served on it without disclosing the threat he had made. That alone should have invalidated the finding. It didn't. The next rumor Tinsley heard was about Chief F.J. Morris, the same Morris who had told George that no bones had been found in the ashes. The rumor was that Morris had found something in the ash, a human heart, that he had packed it in a small metal box, and that he had buried that box, secretly, somewhere on the property. The rumor came from a local minister. The minister said Morris had confessed it to him directly. George Sodder and C.C. Tinsley went to F.J. Morris and confronted him with this. Morris broke. He admitted to burying a metal box. He led them to it. Together they dug it up. They opened the box. Inside was a piece of fresh, raw beef liver. It had never been exposed to fire. It was not from any human being. It was, by appearances, something Morris had bought from a butcher. George later heard from another source what Morris had said about it privately. Morris allegedly admitted that he had buried the liver, hoping that George would dig it up, find it, and accept that his children's remains had been found, so that he would let the case go. 3 years later, in August of 1949, George finally got someone to take the investigation seriously. Oscar Hunter, a pathologist from Washington, D.C., supervised a new dig at the site. After hours of careful searching through the bulldozed earth, the team unearthed several small bone fragments. The fragments were sent to a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution. His name was Marshall T. Newman. Newman examined the bones. He determined they were lumbar vertebrae, bones from the lower spine. He determined they all came from one person. He estimated the age of that person at the time of death, 16 to 22 years old. The oldest of the missing Sodder children, Maurice, was 14. Newman also noted something else. The bones showed no sign of exposure to flame at all. None. He suggested they were not the remains of any victim of the fire. They had come from somewhere else. Most likely, he wrote, from the soil that George had bulldozed onto the foundation in his grief. Tinsley followed the trail of the dirt. He found that some of it had come from a cemetery in Mount Hope, 15 miles away. Nobody could explain why the vertebrae of a teenager had been there. Nobody could explain why they had ended up in the soil over the Sodder children's supposed grave. If the children had not died in the fire, and the bones, or the lack of them, suggested they had not, then where had they gone? The first sighting came that very morning. A bus driver passing through Fayetteville before dawn on Christmas Day had seen something. He told investigators that he had seen people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder house. The fire department had ruled the cause electrical. The bus driver was describing arson. A woman who lived along Route 60 had been watching the flames from her front porch in the early hours of December 25th. As the house was burning, she saw a car drive past her, fast. In the back seat, she said, she had seen children's faces. She thought one or two of them had been looking out the window. A few hours later, another woman was working the morning shift at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston. 5 children came in. With them were 2 men and 2 women. They were served breakfast. In the parking lot was a car with Florida license plates. It was Christmas morning, 1945. A week later, in Charleston itself, a woman named Ida Crutchfield was working the front desk of a small hotel. Around midnight, a group came in. There were 5 children. With them were 2 men and 2 women. They all appeared, in Crutchfield's words, of Italian extraction. Crutchfield tried to speak with the children. One of the men shot her a look she would later describe as hostile. He turned to the other adults and began speaking rapidly in Italian. Conversation in the room stopped. The group left before dawn. Years later, when photos of the missing Sodder children were published, Crutchfield came forward. She believed she had served them. In the years that followed, George Sodder followed every lead he could afford to follow. He drove to New York City after seeing a photo in a magazine of a young ballet dancer who looked like his daughter, Betty. The school refused to let him see her. He drove to Texas. A woman there said one of his missing sons had told her his real name was Louis Sodder. George met 2 men in the area she had described. They denied being his sons. George's son-in-law would later say that George believed they were lying. He believed it until the day he died. George wrote to J. Edgar Hoover, asking the FBI to investigate. Hoover wrote back personally. He said the matter was, quote, of local character and outside federal jurisdiction. The local authorities never requested federal help. In 1950, the West Virginia legislature held hearings on the case. The governor and the state police superintendent issued a joint statement at the end of those hearings. They told the Sodder family that the case was, quote, hopeless. The case was officially closed at the state level. It would remain closed for the next 40 years. In 1968, 23 years after the fire, Jenny Sodder went to the mailbox. There was a letter inside. It was addressed to her. The postmark was Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. She opened it. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It was a black and white photo of a young man, somewhere around 30 years old. He had dark hair, dark eyes, a heavy brow. He looked like Louis Sodder would have looked if Louis had grown up. Louis Sodder, who had been 10 years old on the night of the fire, would have been 33 in 1968. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting, were 4 lines. Louis Sodder, I love my brother Frankie, ill boys, a 90132 or 35. The family stared at it. Nobody knew anyone named Frankie. Nobody knew what ill boys meant. Nobody knew what a 90132 or 35 referred to, but they recognized the face. George and Jenny hired another private detective. He went to Central City, Kentucky. He never returned. They never heard from him again. They were unable to find any trace of him afterward. The photograph stayed in the family. Jenny had it enlarged. She hung it over the fireplace. She added it to the billboard along the highway. She did not include the Central City postmark on the billboard. She left no information that could lead back to where the photograph had come from. Because she was afraid that whoever had sent it might be in danger if anyone knew. In December of 1968, George Sodder gave one of his final interviews. He was 73 years old. He told the reporter that the lack of information had become, quote, like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further. Then he said this, quote, time is running out for us, but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them, end quote. George Sodder died less than a year later, in 1969. He was buried in a cemetery near Fayetteville, 2 miles from the spot where his house had stood. The photograph from Central City was still over the fireplace. His wife, Jenny, outlived him by 20 years. She wore black mourning clothes every single day of those 20 years. She never stopped believing her 5 children were alive. The billboard stood on the side of Route 16, 2 miles outside Fayetteville, West Virginia, for 37 years. It had pictures of all 5 children on it. Morris, 14 years old, Martha, 12, Louis, 10, Jenny Irene, 8, and Betty, 5. It had the photograph of the man from Central City on it. It had the word reward on it. The reward had been $5,000, then $10,000. By the end, it could have been $1 million. There were no takers. Drivers passing through Fayetteville for nearly 4 decades saw it. Some of them remembered the story. Some of them never knew it. The paint faded. The wood weathered. The faces of the children stared out from photographs that had been taken in 1945 and that never aged a day after that. Jenny Sodder died in 1989 at the age of 85. A few months after her funeral, the family finally took the billboard down. By then, the 5 missing Sodder children, if any of them were still alive, would have been in their 40s and 50s. They would have had lives of their own. They would have been grandparents. None of them ever came forward. The last surviving Sodder sibling, Sylvia, the toddler who had been in her mother's arms on the night of the fire, died in 2021. She told an interviewer once that her father, in his last years, would stay up late with her. They would sit by the fireplace under the photograph of the man from Central City, and they would talk quietly about what they thought might have happened. She said, quote, I experienced their grief for a long time. 80 years later, we still don't know. The most common theory among the family and among the older residents of Fayetteville who remember it is that the Sicilian mafia was extorting George Sodder, that his anti-Mussolini stance, his prosperity, and his stubbornness had earned him enemies among the Italian organized crime networks that operated in 1940s Appalachia. Under that theory, the fire was an act of intimidation. The children were taken to make him pay, or to silence him, or both. Some have suggested the children were warned ahead of time to leave the house, that someone tipped them off and told them to slip out the back, that nothing would happen to them if they did, that they were then taken, possibly back to Italy. 80 years later, we still don't know. It would explain why the bus driver saw balls of fire being thrown. It would explain the missing ladder. It would explain the cut phone line. It would explain the trucks that wouldn't start. It would explain the threats from the insurance salesman. It would explain the car watching the kids walk home from school in November. It would explain why for 80 years no bones have ever surfaced. But the alternative, the simpler, sadder, more bureaucratically convenient explanation, is the one the state of West Virginia issued in 5 death certificates on December 30th, 1945. All 5 children died that night, in their beds, in a house fire whose precise nature was never fully investigated. in a town whose fire chief tried to bury a beef liver in a metal box. 5 children, one Christmas Eve, no remains, no answers. If you are watching this, you live in a world where it is now possible for the Sodder children's descendants, if there are any, to take a DNA test and to know. The case is technically still open. If you have information, the family is, by all accounts, still listening. This has been Tales of Terror. The Sodder children disappeared on Christmas Eve, 1945. They are Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Irene, and Betty. If you have any information about this case, contact the West Virginia State Police, Beckley Detachment. If this video meant something to you, subscribe and share it with someone who appreciates a real mystery. We'll see you in the dark.